The Space Shuttle Columbia Disaster, 2003. Picture this. You're cruising down the highway blasting your favorite music when a tiny pebble flicks and cracks your windshield. But you ignore the tiny crack and keep driving. As the day goes by, that little crack slowly spreads until one day your whole windshield shatters. Now, replace your car with a $7 billion space shuttle, that pebble with a chunk of foam traveling at 500 miles per hour, and instead of your windshield cracking, it's a hole in the heat shield keeping astronauts from becoming human toast. That's basically what happened to the Space Shuttle Columbia that claimed the lives of 7 astronauts on February 1st, 2003, while they were cruising back to Earth after a successful 16-day mission. However, the root of the problem that caused this disaster goes all the way back to when the crew launched on January 16, 2003. During the launch, NASA scientists watched as a piece of foam insulation, which looks like a giant chunk of styrofoam, fell off the external fuel tank of the shuttle and punctured a hole in the heat shield. It's like getting hit in the face with a rock-hard loaf of bread flying through the air. However, the scientists concluded that it was not a serious problem and ignored the damage. A classic case of, it'll be fine. Spoiler alert, it wasn't fine. You see, in space travel, heat shields are like the sunscreen of space. Without them, re-entry into Earth's atmosphere is like jumping into a volcano wearing a wool sweater. So when Columbia came back into the atmosphere, superheated gas started leaking into the wing through the hole. It was like opening the oven while your cookies were baking, only these cookies were in a spaceship and the oven was 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This caused the shuttle to break apart, and the entire crew was basically cooked alive in temperatures hotter than the sun's surface. Seoul Bridge Collapse, 1994. Let's say you're building a bookcase with some furniture you got from IKEA, but instead of following the instructions, you're just winging it. You skip a few screws here, misplace a couple of nuts there, and call it a day. The bookcase looks fine at first, but the moment you dropped a few books on it, the whole thing came crashing down like a Jenga tower at a toddler's birthday party. Now, swap the bookcase for the Seoul Bridge and the books for the cars moving on the bridge, and you'd have a clear picture of what happened to the Seoul Bridge in 1994. It's like the bridge suddenly decided it had enough of people driving all over it and took an unplanned coffee break. Except this break involved collapsing into the Han River, taking 32 lives with it and injuring 17 others. The cause of the collapse began with its construction, where poor welding and low-quality materials were used, especially in the steel trusses that were meant to support the bridge. Think of the bridge's steel trusses as the skeleton holding everything together, but if that skeleton is held together with duct tape and wishful thinking, you've got a problem. Over time, the weak welding started to crack. It's like when you overcook a pizza and the crust just breaks apart. Except here, the crust was the entire bridge. This caused the bridge to wobble very badly, which was spotted but completely ignored. It's like ignoring that strange noise your car makes until it's too late. Except in this case, too late was when a huge section of the bridge was in the river. The entire bridge was dismantled and rebuilt in 1997, which cost about $100 million, about 7 times the original price. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, 2010. So, you're filling up your bathtub when you get distracted by your favorite TV show. Next thing you know, water's flooding your bathroom, soaking everything in its path, and you're left with a soggy disaster. Now, swap that water for 200 million gallons of oil and your bathroom for the Gulf of Mexico, and you've got the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This large oil spill happened on April 20th, 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon oil rig was drilling for oil like it was just another Tuesday. When suddenly, the oil well went rogue, shooting oil and gas out uncontrollably like a shaken soda can, but about 1,000 times worse. What caused this disaster was that the crew on the oil rig made a small mistake of not checking crucial pressure tests before turning on the drill. It's like baking a cake and skipping the whole checking if it's done part only to pull out a smoking disaster. But instead of just smoking, the rig practically exploded and sank, which, let's be honest, is not what you want happening at your workplace. Once the rig was down, oil started spilling from the well at the bottom of the ocean, and it just wouldn't stop. For 87 whole days, the oil gushed out like it was auditioning for the world's worst water fountain. By the time they finally plugged it, over 200 million gallons of oil had leaked into the ocean. Imagine filling your backyard pool with crude oil instead of water. Now multiply that by 1 billion. That's how bad it was. The oil spread across the Gulf, hitting beaches, wildlife, and marine ecosystems like a wave of toxic goo. The company threw every cleanup method at the spill like it was an ocean-sized game of whack-a-mole, and they ended up spending $65 billion in fines, settlements, and cleanup costs. Sale of Alaska, 1867. In the early 1860s, Alaska originally belonged to Russia, but at the time, the country wasn't exactly rolling in cash and was worried that Britain might just take it from them anyway if a war broke out because it was so far away and hard to defend. So, Russia decided to sell the icy wasteland. It's like that person trying to offload a piece of property because they needed quick cash. In 1867, the US swooped in like an eagle and bought Alaska for a cool $7.2 million, which, if you do the math, is about 2 cents per acre. That's less than the price you'd pay for a piece of gum. However, it seemed like a fair deal at the time, but in hindsight, it got to be the real estate equivalent of selling a mansion for the price of a used bicycle. Turns out Alaska wasn't just a chunk of ice with a few bears, it's loaded with natural resources like gold, oil, and timber. You can probably imagine Russia's reaction when they realized they'd essentially handed over a treasure chest because they didn't feel like digging for the key. Fast forward to the 20th century, and oil discoveries in Alaska made it one of the wealthiest regions in terms of natural resources. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which pumps millions of barrels of oil, would be like Russia finding out they accidentally sold the winning lottery ticket. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. You've probably played a game of hide-and-seek with your siblings. Now, imagine that each time you're close to finding him, he sets fire to his previous hiding spot and goes to hide elsewhere. That's what Napoleon faced during his invasion of Russia in the summer of 1812. This invasion happened after Napoleon had conquered much of Europe, which had his ego inflated like a beach ball. Unfortunately, at the same time, he had beef with the then ruler of Russia, Tsar Alexander I. Now, instead of sending a strongly worded letter, Napoleon decided to bring 600,000 of his soldiers to teach Russia a lesson, then take over and be back home in time for tea. So, like a guy bringing a tank to a snowball fight, he led his army into Russia, clearing everything in his path, but the Russians just retreated deeper into Russia, burning crops and villages behind. While Napoleon's army kept marching, they found themselves with nothing to eat and nowhere to rest. Think of it like driving cross-country and every gas station, hotel, and fast food joint along the way is suddenly closed. And it wasn't like they could just order Uber Eats. This was the middle of nowhere in 1812. When Napoleon's army finally reached Moscow, they found the entire city empty and burning. The Russians had evacuated. It was the historical equivalent of throwing a party and nobody showing up, except your house is also on fire. Before you know it, Napoleon's army, unprepared for Russian weather, was caught in a temperature that was minus 30 degrees Celsius. Food was scarce, morale was even scarcer, and frostbite was everywhere. One by one, his army was turning into a walking popsicle parade and dropping like flies. Napoleon ordered a retreat, and of course, the soldiers marched back through the same scorched, barren land they'd already crossed, and this time they were being chased by Russian troops and freezing to death. By the time Napoleon finally limped back to France, his army of 600,000 had shrunk to about 100,000 thanks to starvation, hypothermia, and the general stupidity of invading Russia in the winter. Napoleon thought he could steamroll Russia, but instead, Russia iced him out, literally. Gerald Ratner's speech, 1991. Gerald Ratner's speech of 1991 was like pulling the pin on a grenade and then casually tossing it behind you, completely unaware that you've just blown up your entire house. Gerald Ratner was the CEO of Ratners Group, a multi-million-dollar company in the UK that was selling affordable jewelry like hotcakes. Gerald was at the top of his game until one day in April 1991, when he was invited to speak at the Institute of Directors. This should have been a pretty standard no-fuss business speech, but Ratner made two fatal jokes. He said his company's products were total crap. That's right, he flat out said that. And then, to make matters worse, he joked that a pair of earrings his company sold was cheaper than a prawn sandwich, but probably wouldn't last as long. Now, if this had been stand-up comedy, maybe he would have gotten a few laughs. But this was his own product. It's like running a lemonade stand and telling everyone you used old lemons. Suddenly, the lemonade isn't so refreshing anymore. Within hours, the speech spread like wildfire. This was before Twitter, but word of mouth did the trick. Headlines everywhere screamed about how the CEO of a major jewelry company had basically roasted his own products. It was like Ratner had accidentally become his own worst PR nightmare. Customers were furious, and sales plummeted almost overnight. By the end of it, Ratner's jokes had cost the company nearly $900 million in market value, and Ratner's Group eventually had to rebrand itself as Signet Group just to escape the scandal. Gerald himself was forced to step down, which isn't shocking when you've just told the world your products are about as durable as a soggy sandwich. The failure of the Maginot Line, 1940. The failure of the Maginot Line in 1940 is a lot like locking all your doors and windows, but forgetting to close the garage, and then a thief just casually strolls in and robs you. After World War I, France was definitely not in the mood for another surprise visit from Germany, so they came up with a plan to build the Maginot Line, a line of super-fortified defenses along the French-German border, meant to keep the Germans out and give France some peace of mind. These fortifications are giant, heavily armored walls with underground bunkers, tunnels, artillery, and even air conditioning. That's right, air conditioning, so the soldiers could stay cool while defending France. It was basically the ultimate military man cave. France was so confident that nothing could get through the Maginot Line, not even the Germans. And they were right, because Germany just took one look at the impenetrable fortress and simply went around it. Yep, instead of storming through the heavily fortified lines, the Germans just went through Belgium, which is basically adjacent to France and didn't have the Maginot Line, and that was the ultimate mistake France made. It was like someone showing up to a party, seeing the bouncer at the front door, and deciding to just sneak in through the side gate. So while the French were ready for the ultimate defense at the Maginot Line, the Germans essentially strolled in from a completely unguarded direction and literally caught the French off guard. France was overwhelmed by German forces and defeated in an instant, leaving about 92,000 French soldiers dead. Berlin-Brandenburg Airport, 2012 to present. If ever there was a gold medal for how not to build an airport, the Berlin-Brandenburg Airport project would win, hands down. Back in the early 2000s, Germany decided it needed a brand new international airport to replace its two aging international airports. So, after 15 years of planning and an additional 6 years of construction, the new Berlin-Brandenburg Airport, or BER for short, was supposed to open in 2012, but it was postponed because of issues with fire safety. However, more problems started popping up: faulty wiring, malfunctioning doors, insufficient baggage systems, and to top it off, escalators that were too short. They literally built escalators that didn't reach the floor. It's like getting halfway through a water slide and just falling off. All of these mistakes happened because the project had multiple contractors. Each part of the airport seemed to be designed and built by a different team, none of whom talked to each other. Talk about too many cooks in the kitchen. Another construction company got hired to fix all the issues, which cost an extra $8.5 billion and delayed the opening for an extra 9 years. It was like a flight that was stuck on the runway for almost a decade, with passengers, aka the public, just waiting and waiting and waiting. The shiny new gateway to Germany finally opened on October 31st, 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. So, years of wanting to handle massive passenger loads, they opened to, well, almost no passengers. It's like spending years planning a grand opening for your new restaurant, only to open during a power outage. Today, BER works, but it's still haunted by its troubled past, and people still joke that if you want to fly out of Brandenburg, you should bring a tent and prepare for a delay of a few years. The Library of Alexandria's destruction, 48 BCE. Picture this. You've spent years building the ultimate collection of your favorite movies, books, music, and stored them on your hard drive. Then one day, while you're trying to delete a single file, you accidentally wipe the whole thing. No backups, no way to recover it. All those hours spent curating it were gone in an instant. Now, take that feeling, multiply it by 1,000, and you'll start to understand what happened when the Library of Alexandria burned in 48 BCE. This library was practically the ancient world's version of Google, a place where all the knowledge of the known world was gathered in one spot. Scholars from across the globe came to study everything from math and science to philosophy and poetry. Think of it like a university, research center, and Wikipedia all rolled into one. So, on that fateful day, Julius Caesar was in town waging war in Alexandria during a Roman civil conflict. At one point, to gain the upper hand, Caesar thought it would be a great idea to burn the ships in Alexandria's harbor. Well, big mistake, because the fire spread and a good chunk of Alexandria, including the library, got caught in flames. Thousands of ancient texts and irreplaceable works of philosophy, history, and science were wiped out. It's as if your entire internet history was burned, but back then you couldn't Google anything to get it back. Just like that, the greatest repository of human knowledge at the time ended up as ancient toast just because one man wanted to show who's boss. If you love the Evaluator and everything we do, we've got something special for you. Our merch is here. You can now shop to show your support and look cool while you're at it. Links in the description. Lotus Riverside disaster, 2009. One morning in June 2009, a fully furnished, brand new 13-story apartment building in Shanghai, China just tips over and collapses onto its side like it's doing a lazy stretch after a long day. It was so perfectly intact that it didn't even break apart, just laid down like it was tired of standing and wanted a nap. Luckily, no one was inside the building at the time, except for one unlucky worker who lost their life in the disaster. The mistake that caused this disaster was from the builders who excavated soil right next to the building to create an underground garage. As if that was not enough, the builders piled up the excavated dirt into a massive heap right next to the building. The pressure from the huge pile of dirt combined with the weakened soil caused the foundation to give way. To top it all off, heavy rain had soaked the ground, turning it into a slippery, muddy mess. With the soil weakened and no foundation left to hold the building upright, it decided it wasn't going to stand for this anymore. Like someone tired of dealing with life's problems, it just flopped over. After the collapse, investigations revealed all the shortcuts that led to this disaster: flimsy foundation work, poor soil management, and a complete disregard for basic engineering principles. The builders were slapped with fines, and the project's developers faced lawsuits.